Great. So looks like everyone's here. We are now live on streaming this meeting.
Yes, sorry about that. I'm starting the live stream.
No problem. So we can go ahead and get started. The statement regarding virtual meetings is in the packet. That hasn't changed. So just to confirm that we have a quorum, Nicole, can you go ahead and take the attendance by roll call?
Yes, thanks, Miles. Let's see, I'll start with Guthrie County, Mr. Coleman.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Here.
Henrico County, Ms. Meidler.
Here.
City of Richmond, Ms. Clark.
Here.
GRTC, Ms. Torres.
Here.
DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky. I think she's trying to connect right now. And VDOT, Ms. McAdory.
I'm here.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Nicole, I'm connected now.
Hi, Tiffany. You have a quorum, Miles.
Great. With that, I will turn it over to Joe today to chair our meeting.
Yep, so it looks like it's my turn. So welcome, everybody. We'll start off with any amendments to the agenda. Does anybody have any amendments they would like to offer? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move to item 2. This would be approval of the February 8th meeting summary. Does anybody have any changes or corrections to the meeting minutes from February 8th? Okay, seeing none, then I would just ask for a motion and a second to approve.
Sharon Smidler, so moved.
Hi, Ronna. Second.
Dorona has a second. Motion by Sharon, second by Dorona. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Okay, passed unanimously. And I turn it back over to Miles for item number 3.
Thank you. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. So the first item for the agenda today is feedback that we received from the last task. So this was the allocations and funding section that we went through last month. So we've only received comments from 2 localities, and I've just summarized the general comments here. So the first was to change the proposed allocation approach. So what we proposed was the 10% every year in balance entry and really try and allocate all 6 years. The proposal that we received was to leave more balance entry, particularly in the later out years, more along the lines of what we do currently, which would allow us to select projects a little bit earlier and adapt to changing priorities. So shooting for that year 3 or 4 target date for new projects as opposed to year 6. The second item was to use RSTP CMAQ as more of a last resort for cost increases. So this was essentially if a project started on budget and has gone over budget, that the locality should first look to CVTA or other sources of funding and use the TPO source as the last resort. This is already the practice. Essentially, when somebody comes to us with the cost increase, the first thing we normally ask is, well, what other sources do you have that you could fill this gap? So that's pretty in line with the existing practice that we already have. The next item was support for defining a process for leveraging. Wanted to look at it more in detail, but just the idea that we should have it written and some idea of this is what we'll do if you want to leverage the funding, and this is how we'll implement it. And then the last 2 were changes, but they go along with the leveraging concept. So the first one was to dedicate a set percentage of funding for PE. So essentially the concept here would be that PE has fewer risks. There's less of a chance of an overrun on a PE phase. So we should be dedicating more funding towards PE and then use the prioritization to decide which projects get additional funding for right-of-way or construction. So this is a little tricky, and I'm sure Liz can jump in and explain it, but The biggest issue here is that we can't have a UPC that's just PE anymore. So that's how we used to do things, but we're no longer allowed to just have a PE UPC unless it's a study. So it would make it tricky to implement this. Basically, a project needs to be the full project, which would make this a little harder.
And Miles, if you want, I can add a little clarification to that.
Sure.
Basically, if the PE only portion is ever intended to lead to construction, then it cannot be a PE only project. A study might be in the system as a PE only project, but it's not leading directly to construction. So it's a true PE phase could not be a PE only project, if that makes sense. And that's a FHWA rule.
So thanks, Liz. But the point being here that I think this concept, I think the idea of supporting PE on projects is good. This would be very difficult for us to be able to implement because of those rules. So I think the leveraging approach that we presented last week or last month is the closest that we're going to be able to get, where we're funding the first piece of the project with the expectation that the rest of the funding is going to come from some other source.
Excuse me, Miles.
Yes.
We have some background noise. I'm having a tough time following. So maybe everybody be quiet for a second and see if we can pinpoint it. Okay. Yes. Can I ask, we go back and maybe with Liz and repeat what she said? And I missed some of that.
Sure, Liz, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, sure. I was just saying, so, sometimes we have projects in VDOT system and it only has a PE phase, but with federal funding, that's like for a study. But going forward from the FHWA's ruling is that if a PE phase leads to the construction of a project, then we cannot have a PE only project. It's like an IMR or a normal study, totally okay. It'd be listed as PE only. But if it's, like I said, if it's going to actually be a true PE phase to a construction project, then we cannot have it listed as PE only. It has to be fully funded.
And so does the PE mean like it would be like 30% design, or does it get to a certain percentage for study? Or I guess the IMR is different too.
Right. I mean, typical PE for a typical project will be 30% design. Yeah.
So I guess to go back to what our thoughts on this were, so this concept seems good. I mean, I think the idea of getting more PE out there is great, but it would be very hard to implement. So I think what our thought was to leverage the leveraging concept that we'd already presented last month and use that. So we're still funding PE only, but the expectation is there's going to be outside funding for the rest of the project. So any other questions on these comments that we received for the last tasks?
Yeah, this is Chad. I think just one thing to note, I mean, everybody on here is probably on all the committees anyway, but the CBTA TAC is thinking hard now about prioritization. And I think item 4 there is something that everyone is considering. So the conversation that's had with this group is probably going to help guide the decision on the CBTA side and vice versa. So this isn't a silo. Leveraging is important for everybody to think about right now.
Thanks, Chet. And I think we've heard that from several of you throughout this whole process. So I'm sure we'll hear it again. So any other comments, questions on this? All right, hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the final draft. So in the agenda packet was the draft document. I know it's a little lengthy. It was like 20 pages or so. So hopefully you've had a chance to read through it. The overview, essentially this draft incorporates what we went through in each of the meetings through this process. So we just tried to put it all into one document. We also took into account all the input that we received in your comments in the meetings and via the written comments submitted afterwards as we were reviewing the draft. What we're requesting today is a recommendation to TAC. I will go ahead. I've already received questions about it, but I will say it's our ask that we get a recommendation today. If we need to take extra time, we can push this back till April if you need additional time to review this draft. So I just want to go through quickly some of the major changes from what we've presented to you previously. So in terms of the project submissions, when we'd initially presented this to you, we had proposed a cap on the dollars that could be requested for any specific project. And that was proposed to be limited to the average annual across the 6-year plan for that funding source. From the feedback we received, we decided that's probably not the best approach. So we instead went with a cap on the number of applications, which was something we had also discussed in earlier meetings. This is the proposed caps. It's similar to Smart Scale, but this was actually derived completely differently. So the large localities we define as 100,000 or more, which is basically Hanover, Chesterfield, Richmond, and Henrico. The smaller localities are the other 5, Goochland, Powhatan, Charles City, New Kent, and Ashland, and then all the member agencies have their own category. So it'd be 10 for the large localities, 3 for the small. This cap was based on the average from the past 6 cycles. So what we did was we went and looked back to see how many applications were being submitted, and we based it on that. And the proposed cap would be the total number of applications. So you could do 5 RSTP and 5 CMAQ, or you could do 7 RSTP and 3 CMAQ, or all 10 through RSTP. That doesn't really matter as much since they're all going through essentially the same scoring process as proposed. It's just a limit on how many that we have to go through that process on. Since a lot of it would be model driven and data driven, it is more intensive on our end to get these projects scored. So any comments, thoughts, questions on the proposal for caps? Okay, not hearing any. So the next section was the project screening. Just as a reminder, the screening criteria that we looked at was consistency with federal regulations. So essentially, is the project eligible to receive the funding? Is it consistent with the long range plan? Is it well defined? Do we have a decent scope on the project? Do we have detailed estimates and schedules? And this is where we got into VDOT validation and how that would work, and then supplemental materials. We heard your concerns about the VDOT validation process, and having just gone through Smart Scale, we understand that has come up a lot. So we spoke with Liz and tried to come up with something that would be a little more, I think, compatible with different localities and their different approaches to doing it. So the goal through all of this is to improve the coordination with VDOT, the TPO, and the sponsors. And ultimately reducing our cost overruns and the projects from being delayed. So as originally proposed, we're going to stick with it. The applicants should work with the district to validate the cost and schedule if your project's going to lead to construction. This would be informal. There's not going to be a formal pre-application process. It would essentially be coordinating through Liz and working with the district to get an estimate and a recommended schedule. At the end of it, kind of like with Smart Scale, VDOT will prepare a memo, not as detailed as Smart Scale. We're thinking more of a one-page memo with here's our recommended cost and schedule. Then breaking it down, if the project is intended to be VDOT administered, the application absolutely has to match whatever VDOT's saying. The purpose for this being VDOT's going to run it. If they say that's what it's going to cost them, that's what it's going to cost. So we want to match that. If it's going to be locally administered, we still want the memo so we have an idea of what VDOT's thoughts of the risk on the project would be, but agreement's not necessary. So if you're planning to locally administer the project and you think you can do PE for less than the 600,000, which is essentially the floor on most of the VDOT estimates, then we can go with that. It's just that needs to be a locally administered project. And then the other piece of it is you don't need to go through any of this if you've already submitted. So if we've had a project that was validated through Smart Scale or some other VDOT administered program in the most recent round, we don't need to go through all this process because there's no sense in doing it again. We already know what the numbers would be. So this is basically the proposed revision to it. We're trying to give a little bit more flexibility while still getting the input from the district. So welcome any feedback on this proposal as well.
I think that's great about the locally administered, since we may have some different flexibility with meeting that. I'm still thinking about it, some of the VDOT administered, and they need to think about that some more, but I understand where we're coming from. I think this is a good compromise. I just might need to think about it a little bit more.
What, if I could, Miles, one thing I want to add, typically VDOT doesn't technically decide if a project's locally administered or not until the RTA process. However, we all know that we like in this round of Smart Skill, we reached out to the localities that typically locally administer and say, hey, which ones of these do you want to VDOT to administer, or are y'all going to administer? I think we would just kind of follow that same process. It wouldn't be written in stone. However, if there was one that was estimated as locally administered and we decided later on in the process it becomes VDOT administered, it would probably have to it would definitely have to undergo the deeper estimate scrutiny, just because we have that IIM that we have to do that for all projects.
Yes, thank you, Liz. So again, with this, it's not 100%, but we would base it off of the application. So if you suggest that you'll be locally administering the project, that would be the starting point on our end. And then obviously we'd have to adjust if we need to. Any other comments on the proposed screening? And I know this is a lot to take in, so it's okay. We can move on and we can think through it some more. For project scoring, it's much more straightforward. We heard pretty clearly that there was no need to have a preservation and maintenance or an operational improvements category. So we've removed those. So RSTP scoring is either the projects category, which is the same as the Connect RVA scoring and prioritization, or it's the studies category. And for both of those, we've adjusted the weighting to match what was adopted as the revised weighting at in the LRTP advisory committee meeting. So I think the main shift was land use and environment went down from 25 to 20%, and the congestion or mobility measure went up from 10 to 15%. So that was the main change. Any comments, questions on these? Okay. And then the allocations, as I mentioned, we received comments that we need more room early on. And I think we heard that pretty clearly from you at the last meeting as well. So this is a revision to what had initially been proposed. So essentially what we had originally proposed was 10% across the board. Our current approach ramps up from 0 in year 1 up to this 30 to 40% in the later out years. What this does is sort of strike the balance. For the first 3 years, we'll try and lock in and essentially say, these are the projects we're funding early on. And then starting in that year 4, we leave a little extra room so that we can select projects to start next year at the year 3. So it's trying to strike a balance. It's trying to give us a little bit more room to be flexible early while still allowing us to say, we're not changing too much of the plan every cycle. So this is the new proposal. The other interesting fact with this is the percentages, because they are very similar to what we're currently doing. We'd wind up with essentially the same amount of money in balance entry now as what we do now. So in terms of our flexibility, it wouldn't really be a change. The main thing is that we have a little bit more in year 1 and 2 for overruns, and everything else moving forward would be about the same. So any questions, thoughts on that side? Okay. The other changes to the selection and allocations portion that we went over, we did receive a comment from Ride Finders. I know they're not a member of the subcommittee, but they were attending as a member of the public at the last meeting, just wanting to make sure that this wouldn't impact the annual allocation that they receive. So I did add a section to clarify that we would continue with the off the top, and this was based on the TAC meeting back in September or August, where we asked TAC to weigh in on Ride Finders and the TDM program. So this is basically just continuing at the 500,000 level off the top. with the continued requirement for an annual report detailing how this is improving congestion and air quality in the region. The other piece is related to outside funding. We simplified that entire appendix. So this was something that we presented to you very early on in the process. I think it was back in November. But it was pretty complicated and convoluted the way it was worded. So we simplified it. It's much more straightforward now, just to make it clear what will count as outside funding when we're looking at allocations and looking at the prioritization and weighting cost benefit analysis. Any questions or comments on these two? Okay. So that's pretty much the summary of what we've changed from what we've heard from you guys through this process. As I mentioned, I know it's a 20-page document or so. What we are requesting today is a recommendation to TAC. However, if the subcommittee does not feel ready, we are able to take another month if needed and come back in April. We don't have the meeting scheduled, but we could set it for the following the same schedule. So right after the CVTA TAC in April. So with that, I'm open to any additional questions or discussion on this.
Miles, have you given any thought yet to the actual application form that would be utilized?
Yes. So we haven't, until we've gotten this out of the way, we haven't finalized it. But the thought is to move away from the Google Forms and to look into something a little bit more sophisticated where we could have multiple people entering it, that sort of thing. In terms of what it would look like, we haven't gotten through that process yet because we're still kind of waiting until we see what the new guidelines will be.
Yeah, there were a couple questions on the, I guess would be the existing application form that just appeared to be asked just for the sake of asking and didn't really seem to be utilized in any calculated score. So, you know, those would be the types of things that I would ask you all to look at, and because it is difficult to collect this information, that we're only providing that information, and hopefully we're not providing a whole lot of information. I mean, hopefully the you know, kind of the burden is on staff to, you know, pull from the various available data sources to utilize in the scoring and not rely on individual members to come up with that. And then you have to validate it too. It's, you know, what is the source did you use for crash data, Joe?
Yeah, so that's a great point. Our goal with this, with the Connect RVA guidelines, is obviously something that we can do internally. So as much as possible, we're going to be using the model and using our GIS tools that we've developed for that process for these projects. I think where it'll be a little bit trickier is on projects, and this is less for RSTP and more for CMAQ, that are local. You know, local streets are very difficult for us because they're not in the model. So that's the areas where we would need more data from the sponsors of the projects or the applicants. But for anything that's on the regional network, it would largely be something that we just essentially need to know what the project is doing and where is it at, and we should be able to take it from there.
Right. So back to your question, and I was one of those individuals that contacted Miles right before the start of the meeting to say that I would like to have some more time to be just totally open. I haven't read through the entire draft, and I'd like to read it in its context, and just haven't had enough time to get to it, quite frankly. So if it doesn't impact our schedule or there's no urgency, then I would ask that we take another month to and then come back to this.
This is Sharon. I agree with you, Joe. I didn't get a chance to fully read through that and would like, even if it's until if the time constraint is tight and we can't push it off to a decision to next meeting, even if we could have like a week to review it and maybe schedule a sooner meeting if time is a concern. But I'd like some more time to review it, please.
Okay, well, that's two of us. How does everybody else feel about that? Well, are there any objections to taking a little bit more time?
Pretty strong emotions out there, guys.
This is Diana.
Yes.
Yeah,
fine.
I think more time, good. Not to slow the process, to make sure I can get the staff input that I agree.
This is Adrian. I agree as well.
Okay. I think we almost have a consensus, Miles.
Okay. So does the subcommittee have a preference? The next meeting, based on what we've been meeting this year, would be on the 12th, which would be right after the CVTA TAC again. Does that work for everyone to schedule that one?
Works for me.
Okay. Well, if anyone does have a conflict, just let me know and send us an email. But we'll try and get out an invitation for that next meeting. And we'll just, if you have any comments or anything else that you'd like to share on the final draft, please get them to me in advance before we get to the meeting, and then we can just go through it. And then again, the goal would be next meeting if we could make a recommendation. So if we need to make revisions in the meeting, it can be more of a working meeting. But the goal for that meeting will be to get something back to TAC for the May TAC meeting.
Okay. I think that's reasonable. Okay. So I guess with that, does anybody else have anything they would like to share at this point?
I did want to ask a question to Miles, and I'm sure others are interested too. With this round's RSTP CMAQ applications, when do you anticipate those recommendations of awarded or recommendation of projects? I saw it wasn't on the March TAC meeting. Are we anticipating April or?
So we are intending to bring something tomorrow.
Okay.
It's very last minute. And I don't know, Chad, if you want to get into anything now, but essentially the allocations available are very different than what we had in September. Because of that, there's been a lot of work at the last minute. So we've been working diligently with Liz and Larry to get something prepared to bring to you tomorrow. Not asking for action tomorrow, but we'll have the full drafts for you available to look at tomorrow.
I don't have much more to add.
Okay.
We're seeing impacts of the last year, I think. So let that set the
So less
stage.
money available for award. Okay.
That's across the board, obviously, statewide, unfortunately.
Yes. Okay. Well, as always, it's nice seeing everybody's smiling face. And so we'll see you on the next Zoom or go to or whatever. That's it. We adjourn.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Nice job,
Thanks.
Miles. Thank you.